So first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this project of oral narratives of Latinos in Ohio. Today is Monday, August 17th, 2020. Can we start with your full name, please?
My full name is Joseph Joel Souza.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Ohio, grew up in Ohio all my life, actually. So I am a native of the state, but my family has mixed heritage from everywhere. My mom is Puerto Rican, abuela came from the island, and then my dad is of mixed Iberian descent, Spanish and Portuguese.
Okay,
As
great.
for me, Ohio all the way. So.
Where in Ohio did you grow up? Columbus?
Not Columbus, kind of all over Cleveland area, Lorain, where there's a lot of the Puerto Rican community down there, and then a time in a small town called Wellington, which is close to that area, and then Canton, Ohio, for a lot of years, and I went to college in Canton.
Okay, great. Yeah. Tell me about your childhood. What was your daily life like? Growing up in this different smaller cities, right? And
yeah, because a lot of times I did live in suburban communities. My dad is a pastor as well, so I grew up immersed in religious communities and grew up in church. That, and then also he's an educator at a university, a professor. So I grew up kind of immersed in the worlds of education, university life, and the very religious Puerto Rican community, Pentecostal Puerto Rican community, to be more specific, so very charismatic, and so that colored a lot of my childhood growing up. My parents, a very kind of just a typical American suburban mixed culture couple, because my dad is not Caribbean, so I definitely grew up with my feet in two different worlds culturally, where, he's of Iberian descent, but predominantly is Caucasian American, right? By just appearance, and with my mom's side of the family is different, because more recent immigrants, my abuela did not speak English for the first 20 years that she lived in the States, so that was my mom's first language, and I grew up speaking kind of like Spanglish, not fluent Spanish, but it was always there, and there was definitely that mixture and that color. So I had a good childhood, just one sister, a big extended family though, with a lot of connections everywhere. I would say my childhood was just very sort of diverse for the places that I grew up in, for the suburban kind of communities that I was immersed in. So.
This extended family, was it primarily your mom's side of the family or your dad's, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both, actually. On my mom's is interesting, though, because a lot of the Puerto Rican community I grew up with, not everyone that I grew up with as family were necessarily relatives. The story on my mom's side is a little interesting, because my abuela did not stay connected with any family on the island. I don't know of any relatives that are still on the island. I know I have them, but she was adopted, so to say, kind of like left in a basket at the doorstep, knock and run sort of a situation, and ended up making her way to the States with really no connections to anyone, and just built her life from scratch as a 17-year-old.
In Ohio?
In New York first, actually, New York City. New York is America for Puerto Ricans.
Right.
So and then eventually moved, wanted to get away from the concrete jungle, and ended up moving to Lorain, Ohio, where most of the Puerto Rican community was there. That's where my mom grew up, and a lot of my connections to this day are still there. I have a lot of people through church, through a lot of other institutions that are my family, but not necessarily relatives.
Right.
So.
And what about your dad's side of the family, or that community?
Yeah, he grew up kind of a typical, for the most part, a Caucasian American experience in, sort of middle class family. He's one of four boys, so he has a lot of, my mom is also one of four, so I grew up with a lot of aunts and uncles, and then I have a lot of cousins as a result of that. So that was kind of his experience. His grandfather yes, his grandfather did speak Spanish, and it just got lost after that because it was Spanish heritage that they had. But in my experience, I feel like I've noticed that any immigrant community that can pass as white in the United States over, just a handful of generations, sometimes just one generation, ends up sort of losing the unique flavor of their heritage. And I think that's a little bit of the case of that is the case of what happened with my dad's side of the family is, you lose the things that are distinctively Iberian. But then he married my mom who, very distinctly Puerto Rican,
Does she speak Spanish?
Yes.
Your mom?
Yeah, it's her first language.
Did you speak Spanish at all, like as a child and with your sister? Are you older or younger?
I'm the oldest. I have a little sister who's now going into her sophomore year in college. And we grew up, like I said, mostly speaking Spanglish for the most part. Not really fluent Spanish, but the most fluent I ever got was with my abuela when she ended up getting Alzheimer's disease, actually, and she couldn't live by herself anymore, and it was just her living on her own. So she moved in, and for quite a few years, actually, we had her in the household with us, and my mom was her full-time caretaker. And then with the Alzheimer's disease, any English that she learned, she completely reverted back to Spanish. And you would maybe even say something to her in English and she'd understand it, but her response, it would compute and the response would be Spanish. So as a result of that, that was a period of time where my Spanish was at its best. And I pretty much credit all the Spanish that I know to abuela and to that time period, because in order to communicate with her, it was a necessity.
Right. So it sounds like, in terms of culture, the Puerto Rican culture was more present in your life than maybe the Spanish culture, correct? Tell me about some of the traditions or things that you identify as Puerto Rican, practices that your mom and your abuela tried to pass on or keep alive in your lives, yours and your sister's.
Yeah. I think there's definitely sort of the surface aspects to any culture, like food and, and language and customs. So, I mean, I grew up rice and beans all the time, tostones, acapurria, all of that. I grew up with the food, and I cook the food to this day. I love it. It's one of my hobbies, like mofongo, all of that. The music, definitely grew up, salsa dancing and Celia Cruz and all of that, and Gloria Estefan, love it. And then, some of the customs, like my sister did have a quinceañera, there's a lot of that flavor. And then I think also the way that religion, the way that the Christianity was expressed was it had distinctive Caribbean flavor to it. Because at times, my dad is a pastor and had pastored different churches over time. And in more recent years, he's pastored churches that were predominantly white. And I remember when we started going to the white churches, not even having the language to articulate the difference that I was experiencing or the difference that I noticed, right? In the way that everything, the way that worship was conducted, the way that preaching was conducted, now I think I understand that, our expressions of Christianity, and especially the Pentecostal Christianity I grew up with, in a way, takes on an approach to spirituality that comes from our ancestry, which is an emphasis on allowing spirit to enter the body and really letting loose with the body and dancing and being loud and emotional. It's very emotive and expressive. And I noticed a huge difference with the white churches where you worship with your words more than with your body. And there's a sense of respectability politics that plays a bit of a more of a role in some of the white churches. And so I think that religion was one of the biggest places where I noticed cultural difference. And then other really deep cultural values that are really deep that I think I grew up with is emphasis on the family, and you know, that you belong to the community more so than kind of the individualistic approach of, you know, focusing on career or focusing on, I don't know, you know, yourself as an individual. And I think I always grew up trying to strike a healthy balance between the two and learning from the two. I hope to this day that I do live out a healthy balance of it.
So did your dad pastor with sort of the Latino church as you, yeah?
Yes. In my earlier years, from when I don't know what ages, I mean, 7 years old maybe to about 12 years old, something around that time period, he was serving alongside my Tío Santo, who's a pastor of a church that was predominantly it was mostly Puerto Rican and African American. So for some of my formative years, we were in that church and a part of that community. That was where I was connected to a lot of the youth and a lot of programs. And we went from that to a very white church when we moved to Canton, Ohio, where we moved for his, you know, he teaches at Malone University. And so to be in closer proximity to the university, we had moved. And it was definitely a change, a switch to where we were around more white, you know, white people than we had been before. And so, my dad is very, very interesting because he's been able to traverse all these different worlds, you know, as well.
What did your mom do when you were a child? What profession, or was she primarily working from home?
Yeah, she was primarily a you know, stay-at-home mom when I was little. And then ended up working here and there. You know, she had like a home-based business at one point. But then in the long term, she got connected with the local library. And she's been doing that for quite a few years and serves as the fiscal officer, co-assistant. I don't actually know her title, but yeah, she works in the library now. So that's what she's been doing.
Did you ever travel to Puerto Rico?
Yes, one time only, and which was a very interesting trip. The purpose was it was actually because Abuela's Alzheimer's was getting worse. She had been diagnosed very early. She was only in her 50s when she was diagnosed, and when the signs got really, really, really bad, and it became clear to us that it was unsafe for her to live by herself in her apartment. We knew that one of the siblings would need to become the full-time caretaker. My tias and tío do not live in state. They live all over. I have a tia in Florida, in Georgia. So we were the closest people to Abuela because she still lived in Lorraine, in like Lorraine area. And so the decision was made that Abuela would come live with us. She also lived with my tia Sonia for a time, so I might be messing up the order of who she lived with first. But regardless, we needed to get a hold of the power of attorney, and all of her documents, her birth certificate, were in Puerto Rico. So that was the reason for us going, and we made it like a family trip. That was one of the most formative trips I've ever had, because it wasn't just a vacation. We went and had very little all we had was Abuela's memory of a few numbers, which we figured was her address in Puerto Rico, and we were able to track down where she's from. Manatí, Puerto Rico, small little coastal town named after the animal, the manatees. And we went and we found her birth certificate at her school, and it was quite an experience. And even found her stepbrother still living in their old house. So
Wow, that I imagine that was an amazing trip.
Yeah.
So you said you kind of grew up speaking Spanish a little bit, and then when your abuela got to live with you full time, then you were more fluent, or you use the language more. Can you tell me a little bit more about your experiences with speaking Spanish? Like you said, you probably used it the most with your abuela. Was there any instances, did you use Spanish with other people? Were you able to use Spanish in public, and what was that like? Were there any maybe negative memories that you have with the language, or positive?
Yeah, mostly I have taken initiative to put myself in Latinx environments. So for example, to go back to cooking as one of my hobbies, it's one of my favorite things. I love going to the, supermarkets, the botanicas. Like I do, wherever I live, like anywhere that I've moved, I've always located, where are the Latino businesses, where are the markets, where can I get the food products that I wouldn't find at Giant Eagle, Right. So when in those environments, I would make an effort to use Spanish. And it is always a very humbling experience because my Spanish is broken. And also, a heavy sort of Caribbean accent, because that's what I grew up with. And ever since we moved away from like the Lorraine area, most of the Latinos that lived in the cities that I lived in were not Caribbean, but more Central American or maybe Mexican. And a lot of the supermarkets were more geared towards the Mexican community than they were any Caribbean Spanish-speaking communities. So there's definitely slang and words. I came to learn that I grew up with a very distinctive Puerto Rican Spanish, with very particular dialect, I guess. And so definitely I have had that surreal experience of feeling like an outsider in Latino environments, which is interesting because that's the same in Caucasian spaces. I very much am an outsider and feel like an outsider. So in a way, part of it is being bicultural or multi-ethnic, that you don't fully belong in either world. You're kind of your own thing. You are your own diplomatic relationship between cultures. And sometimes that was negative, only in the terms of creating a dynamic in which I have to understand myself or be more intentional about understanding myself and where I fit with my culture and my identity. But I would flip that as also being a positive, because I had to intentionally think about identity. And it's also been the source of me thinking very intentionally about race, in this country. And I've lived in the United States all my life. And I have lived outside of the United States before. I lived in China for 6 months studying. And being outside of the country, I think it gives you this, it gives you the opportunity to really see how race obsessed this country actually is. And to come back into it, I think I have a much better understanding of the complex relationship between my appearance, which for the most part I present as white anywhere that I go. So here I am, a recipient of white privilege by default. And yet, though, internally, that is not, I don't feel white. And what I would mean by that is when I'm in white spaces, I don't belong. And it doesn't take long for others to recognize that. Yes, once I open my mouth, once people get to know me, it doesn't take long for all of a sudden that experience to happen where it's like, oh, you are an outsider. And then I think an added, what complicates that even more is that Puerto Ricans are considered a brown culture, regardless of the fact that we're extremely diverse racially. And, in the island, we have black, white, and everything in between. But the United States has sort of racialized all Latinos as brown people, regardless of what we actually look like. And as a brown considered culture, that places us sort of in the psyche in a certain place in the racial hierarchy. So then, you know, when I am interacting with people, there's this weird thing that happens where it's like, oh, you're white, and then they learn, oh, you're not white, you're actually part of a brown culture. Well, wait a minute. And it's a lot of times I think people don't know how to take that and don't know how to react. And that's just been a factor in every relationship I've ever had, in anywhere I've ever gone, and it's been a very interesting a part of my experience.
How was that? That you, those things that you just shared, how did you manage, or what was the experience like during your school years, like in K through 12? How was that? Were you, did you identify as Latino then? Were you seen probably in some cases as Latino or not?
Right. I've always identified as Latino. And I remember, it's one of my earliest memories. I must have been 5 years old when I remember a peer of mine, I don't even know if it was in school or not, but almost like reacting very confused, but not just confused, almost like irritated that I said I was Puerto Rican, you know? And that's an experience that has carried. It's one of the weirdest reactions that I get, but I get it often, usually from white people, where there's this kind of irritation that, and I almost have processed that. I don't know. I'm a sociologist at heart, is what I studied in college, and I almost like wonder if a part of that is this sense of like, you have the opportunity to pass when people look at me, right? You have the opportunity to pass. You could just get away with being a white boy, right? And walking through this country as a very privileged person. And it's almost like you're, you know, it's like, why aren't you doing that, right? Why aren't you just passing? And I think it just sort of is confusing to people sometimes. And then that happens too with Latinos, because I do think that, you know, I mean, obviously for Latinos that cannot pass as white, have a vastly different experience than I do. You know, they don't have the opportunity to sort of, like one of my privileges, I have the opportunity to identify as Latino when it's convenient for me. And then I could just stay quiet and allow my white privilege to, you know, work for me when, you know, I can sort of opt in and out. It's one of my privileges. And I have family members that do not look like I do and that don't have that privilege. So I think sometimes that acts also as a factor that sometimes complicates my relationship with other Latinos. There's this sense of, I almost sometimes experience a sense of imposter syndrome within my own communities, I think, is what it is.
Mistrust, maybe, too?
Oh, what's it again?
Mistrust? Like they don't trust you?
Distrust and disconnect. I think just the fact that it's a different experience, just a sense of disconnect, and then also maybe some dysmorphia with what our identity is. Like, what are we? And I think that's a question that all of us contend with. Like, what are Latinos? And that goes back to the way that institutionally Latinos are racialized, and that doesn't work for us. Like, it just doesn't work for our communities because we're inherently diverse, racially, linguistically, historically, culturally. We're incredibly diverse, and we're all sort of thrown into this pot at Latino, right? We're, you know, Mexicans and Central American, Brazilians, Puerto Ricans, and we're all really, really different from each other. Like, not a monolith at all. And I think that being thrown in together, it creates this dynamic. And I think another, to answer your question in another way, you know, you ask about like school experience. Another part of my identity is I am queer. And that, I think more of the traumas that I experienced growing up had to do with that, but there's of course the intersectionality, right? Usually our identities work together to create our experiences. I think that as a more kind of like most of the time kind of feminine presenting male, who is queer. That colored my experience a lot, and I did grow up with a lot of fear in school, in public schools, and I ended up not staying in public school. There was one year where I went to a private Christian school. That was traumatic. Did not go back. And then I was homeschooled for some time, but through one of the like public sanctioned online programs. So it was still like public curriculum, but at home. And I ended up doing that all through high school because where we lived at the time, I think I didn't say it at the time, but now I can look back and be honest that I felt very unsafe in the public school environments. I definitely experienced a lot of homophobic or heteronormative toxicity that I didn't have language at the time to identify what was happening or why I was afraid or what it was I was feeling. But somehow internally I knew that I was a target and I was unsafe because of the way I presented. Yeah, and I think just a lot of people didn't know how to take me, right? And didn't know how to, and plus I was, you know, contending with my own identity. I mean, it took me a while to come out. So, so I think that was a big part of the experience growing up, that definitely it intersects, my queer experiences intersect with my experience of understanding myself culturally.
Great. What are some of the different jobs you've had here in Ohio? You went to school to the university in Canton, or where?
Yes, Malone University in Canton.
Okay, and then eventually you moved to Columbus. Tell me about that. Your work as a young Latino professional.
Yeah, I out of college ended up getting connected with the Legislative Service Commission Fellowship Program that is, you know, they operate here in Columbus out of the Legislative Service Commission institution, which was that I did not expect to go that route at all after college.
What did you major in?
Sociology? Yeah. I minored in sociology. I would have majored had they offered it as a major, but I double majored in history and global international studies. And I did a brief focus on Chinese history and language studies, which is what brought me to China for that time. So my focus was definitely very sociological, very humanities, you know, and what I wanted to do, and still I think want to do, is get involved in academics long term, and possibly, you know, possibly teach at university or do research or something of that sort was what I wanted to do. But I had made a decision to move to Columbus after college. I just had my sights set on the Capitol, and it was one of my professors that told me about the fellowship program, and I just didn't even know what I was applying to, and I just applied. And just ended up getting in, you know, the internship, right? It's a temporary internship. And that got my foot in the door in the legislature, and I ended up getting hired full-time with Senator Teresa Feder, who represents Toledo, Ohio. Again, did not at all expect to go this route, public service. That was not what I was going to do. But the opportunities came my way, so I took them. And I think I was excited to just try. I've always been adventurous, so just to try something that, again, I didn't necessarily know what I was doing or know what I was getting into, and just to see where it would take me for the short term, because I wanted to take a break from school. So I thought, let me just take a few years of a break from school and do whatever and get some experience, and that's what I've been doing. It's been 2 years now. I've been in the legislature, and I really value it, and I've valued the experience to network, the opportunity to network the way that I have. And now recently got connected with LULAC, Ohio. Essentially what's happened is doors have opened for me to learn about things that are out there that I didn't even know. And I think that's what I wanted to happen, was to see what's out there that I can you know, get involved with. And I think the timing is really good because ever since the pandemic now, I have been situated, or I am situated in a position where I have some influence and some voice, or at least that I have some proximity to those who are leaders and have influence and a voice. And I, in a sense, can sort of represent for the identities that I represent, you know, the Latino community, the queer community, and that I think has been valuable.
Right. So, like you mentioned, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's summer 2020, and we're going through this with no knowledge of when, you know, it's going to end or how things are going to turn out. So I just have a few questions about this. I mean, obviously you work with the government, so I wanted to ask you how you found out about the pandemic, and what were your initial thoughts and reactions about this?
I hate to admit, at first I didn't take it serious.
Most of us, yeah.
But that is when I first heard about it. Was very early on. Actually, I remember receiving an email in the Senate district inbox from the health department about this, you know, coronavirus COVID-19 thing that is happening in China, and we're sort of keeping an eye on. And that was in January. I saw that first email and didn't pay much attention to it because you know, with my job, I'm very local focused. You know, I'm more focused on what is happening in Toledo, the district that we serve, and kind of you know, have had to hone my attentiveness to that, and so just didn't really pay attention. Then I started hearing more about it on the news, and again I thought, well, you know, I don't know, I just didn't pay attention to it or take it serious until I had some travel, some trips that I had scheduled. I went and celebrated Mardi Gras in New Orleans 2020 and I had that scheduled with a friend to go celebrate her birthday, and I also was going to go to Boston to visit my sister at her university. So that was in early March that I had those trips planned, and I hearing more and more about the intensifying of this virus, and by then it had made its way to the States, and I had to really think about, is this a threat? Is this dangerous to me to fly and to visit these high populated cities? I still went. Which, you know, I later learned it was very dangerous to be in New Orleans during Mardi Gras, you know, and that they had a terrible, terrible situation. Still have, you know, that they're dealing with. But, you know, that's what made me, and then also I'm visiting my sister in Boston, and we get a notification that our Airbnb had to be canceled because the host tested positive. So, you know, that was when I started to really get nervous and think, oh my goodness, what is happening? And then the very next week when I returned to work, we got the notice that we were going to need to start working from home. And that's when I really knew this is no joke, because, you know, the Senate, they don't do that. they don't do that. So yeah, I then got very nervous, more for my parents who and other family members that, you know, I have a tia who actually, has just been recovering from breast cancer. So I have some family members that are high, or were high, risk. Yeah, thank you. And that was where more of my concern was. And what quickly happened was I think I got very overwhelmed with feeling this burden of having to know everything, right? Because of the position that I was in as a legislative aide, and you know, I'm watching the governor's press conferences every day, and I'm getting alerts directly to my email about everything, right? And I think what quickly happened is I entered a mental space of being very overwhelmed with this sense of responsibility for knowing everything and then carrying that knowledge to the communities that I'm connected with and that I represent that aren't getting that knowledge, you know, that aren't that don't know what's happening, right? And I was asked. I had lots of phone calls from a lot of people, like family members and others that are, what's going on, and this, and that, and you know, is this unsafe? What should we do? Should I try and get tested? And how do you get tested? And because of the position that I was in, and I think this is just kind of an experience that's typical of any, you know, any person of color or any person that comes from a marginalized community, when you're able to be one of those who enter a space of leadership or a space of proximity to people in power, you have like a burden on you, or you feel the sense of burden on you that maybe your white colleagues and you know, counterparts don't, because your community is going to look to you, right? And and I think I definitely had that experience and continue to have that experience throughout this pandemic, where it messed a little bit with my sense of, you know, competence with, you know, my job, and am I good at my job, and am I I think it messed with it exacerbated my imposter syndrome. It had all these effects where, because I half the time really felt like I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't have answers to a lot of questions, and here I was with questions, you know, not knowing what things were going to look like, not knowing what the continued impact was going to be, and still to this day, none of us really know what life is going to look like anytime soon.
Who has been most impacted by this within your family, by the virus, the pandemic, the stay-at-home orders?
A lot of my family's been fortunate because I don't really have any really close family that has lost work. Just a few, but most of my family have been able to adjust so that they can keep working. Yeah, and whether it's remotely or just changing the way that they were doing that. So I haven't had a lot of people in my life that, you know, were unemployed or that, and a lot of my family have been pretty healthy, and there's only a handful of people, I think I could count on my hands, those that I know that are actually close to me that did test positive at one point or contract the virus, and most of them didn't actually experience symptoms. I think it was really only one person was really close to me that actually did experience symptoms but was able to recover. So a lot of my family's been pretty fortunate in that regard, and I think, which is atypical, you know, because I've heard of others that aren't as close to me, right, but that I am connected to, that are in my networks or relative networks, family networks, that lost their job, or that, if anything, that are living in fear because I do know a lot of people that work on the front lines that are essential workers. A lot of Latinos are essential workers. A lot of LGBTQ young people are essential workers. And then there's, you know, most of my family and relatives do speak English, so I don't have a lot of people in my life that experienced the difficulty of just translating, right, all of the information we were getting. Just a handful. I have another Tia who actually translates professionally. Is what she does. So she was doing some of that, but
right. How did the lockdown affect you personally, like your daily life, your not only professionally but maybe socially, or like people in your family? Did you feel like, were they able to manage that okay? What were your experiences?
There was definitely a lot of heartbreak for those who, there were some quinceañeras and weddings that had to be canceled or put off. That's a huge disappointment for people. But I think, so there's a good and bad impact on me personally. I am definitely a very social person. I'm very outgoing. I like to go out, and prior to the pandemic, I was rarely at home. if I wasn't at work, I was out at some type of an event, or or I was. I'm a social butterfly. I like to go out. I like to be involved in the community, and in the city of Columbus has a lot to offer for young people. So, so that all came to a halt. And in a way, it was very healing and healthy, because I think I also, while I'm social, I also like my me time. And so I think I personally benefited a little bit from everything slowing down, and from having some solitude, it's sort of in a spiritual and emotional way. It proved to be healthy, and instilled in me kind of a lot of introspection for what I'm doing in my life, and am I okay, and am I healthy, and what do I want to change? So, I mean, personally, I've actually been very productive in 2020 because of the extra time, and because of the lack of distraction, and the freedom of my calendar, and then also working remotely, where I'm very much in my own space, uninterrupted, and I feel like I have been more productive with my job. I have been more productive with anything that I'm involved in, and have been able to take on new things, like become a member of LULAC. And so that's been the positive. But yeah, the negative is definitely where, some social things that I hate, I hated that someone's quinceañera had to get canceled, or that some of those things happened. Also, our communities tend to be very touchy-feely. I grew up with that. I'm a hugger. And so in the few times where I would see people, it's so awkward. Like, I don't even know what to do with myself. Even, we were talking before, me coming in here and kind of, hi, I don't know what to do with my hands. I don't know, that's weird. Having to wear masks is weird, because a lot of the way that I communicate and the way that I read people is facial expressions. And I think that's been a surreal experience for sure. It's been an adjustment,
Do you feel, so you serve, as you said, you have a focus with the Toledo community. What things do you think that the government overall, or your office, has done to support the community there? And I don't know if you are specifically working with the Latino community, but if that's the case, what has been the response to that particular community, or immigrants? Are we doing enough to provide information and resources to the communities that are often, like you said, essential workers, or that, that there's no way for them to work remotely? I don't know if you can comment on some of those things.
Well, I think short answer, no. I don't think we're doing enough. I think it's been one of the major frustrations of my entire office. And my boss, Senator Fetter herself, has expressed a lot of frustration about what we're seeing. I mean, the district, Toledo, it's a city, so it's a more urban, a lot of the constituency are, living in urban environments. We have a lot of constituents that are low income, and a lot that are non-white. So one of the things that all legislative offices have really had to step up with is with assisting constituents with their unemployment situations and their claims, connecting them to the Department of Job and Family Services. I don't know how much of my time, the percentage of, all the stuff I was doing in the office went to that alone, just answering constituents and assisting them in their direct, immediate needs. And that's where a lot of the staff, our time goes, is in just the immediate, case by case needs that come our way. And the larger sort of overarching kind of I think a lot of your question is more like, are we doing enough in the larger scale, right? In the big picture, you know, the individual offices a lot of times aren't, that's something that has to be done collaboratively, right? So on their own, we can only really make waves with that if we're working collaboratively. And one of our frustrations is how politicized this has gotten, and it's become, to be honest, and I'm off the clock so I can say this, but like it's become you know, it's become a political issue to take COVID-19 seriously. And so because of that, you know, there's only so much that we can really do. You know, we've been advocating for a variety of different things that we think should be done in order to help vulnerable populations. I'll throw out an example is like to provide more testing and to make it more accessible to people has been a huge thing that my boss has advocated for, because what we've seen is a lot of people don't, you know, they have to go through so many different steps in order to get a test. And for those who don't speak English, and for those who, or just even if it's not that language, but speaking the language of healthcare and navigating, the institutions itself, that's a language that not every, you know, I mean, you have to learn that. And, you know, a lot of people just don't have access to that. And then a lot of people, understandably, are just upset that they are out of work, you know, they don't have income. And so I think this speaks to the type of society we live in, the fact that people are willing even to put their health at risk because to them the priority is I need income. That's just the reality for a lot of people. And I think that, you know, a lot of people are in this position where they have to make a choice. And so those who are in more vulnerable populations are often contending with that. No, I don't think we're doing enough. And that's why I have been glad outside of the legislature to be able to connect with LULAC, Ohio, where, you know, being sort of the go-to civil rights organization for Latinos, have started working collaboratively with the NAACP, which of course is that for the African American community. So working together to create what they're calling a Black and Brown agenda. This is happening now as a response to COVID, where what we're doing is, you know, this is all volunteer, but what we're doing is we're trying to identify exactly where the gaps are in every facet of our society, and then figure out what we want to do about that, and what are our suggestions as to how to handle it, you know. Personally, I think it goes deep, and I think we have a lot of problems on an institutional level or on a systemic level that's the reason that we have so many inequities.
Right. How do you think our community, in particular the Latino community, has been most affected by it? And you mentioned a little bit that initially, right, there was we couldn't get the information in Spanish fast enough, right, for our community. What other things did you see maybe initially, or what things, you know, there's still opportunities for us to do better?
Well, the issues is definitely access to information and access to actual assistance, access to testing, access to, you know, unemployment assistance. All of that is an issue. Latino families that are maybe lower income, or maybe they're, you know, immigrants that may not have access to broadband and internet, everything, you know, since now we're remote, I mean, everything, if you don't have access to internet, or you don't have a laptop, or you can't go to the library now, you can't, you're just cut off, and there's no way for you to
even telehealth.
all of the above. So I think there's that, and then I think the fact that you know, disproportionately Latinos are essential workers. Like, that is just the reality, that they're there on the front lines, and you know, I think there's been increased exploitation. I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about it's just the position, you know, that a lot of recent immigrants are in, a lot of, especially the undocumented community, very, very concerned about the undocumented community, who's already not even going to be likely to ask for help out of fear. So what do you do there?
Right.
You know, so, and then, let me see, I forget the original question.
Yeah, how the community has been most impacted, which you mentioned. And I'm glad you brought up the undocumented community too, that is unlikely to, that's already vulnerable and probably unlikely to ask for help because of fear. Joseph, what, I just from listening to you, I can guess there's been many proud moments in your life. Just the new experiences that you're having and the work that you're doing. But what comes to mind when I ask you what the proudest moment of your life is so far?
Ooh.
You're still young. There's more to come.
Yeah. I think, well, it's personal, but coming out was my proudest. I mean, this is why even we use the terminology pride, right? Like, you know, there's a reason we do that. There's a reason that's the word that we choose because, you know, again, my upbringing is very interesting because growing up in a very intensely religious environment, right? And not just that, but growing up as a part of a family that are leaders in the religious communities, right? And then to be queer, and then also. You
attended a Christian university too.
Yeah, I did. I attended a Christian university, and then also Latine, and you know, I mean, our community, we definitely have a lot of conversations we need to be having about gender dynamics in our community, and about you know, we always talk about machismo, and we always talk about how these are even how our language is so gendered, and you know, what do we even call ourselves, right? Latinx, Latino. I've been using Latine since, you know, with an E instead, because I feel like that accommodates our actual language a little bit better. Well, I would have never been able to say Latinx. Latinx, like it never would have happened. So, so I think that when I think about that, I think my positioning in the world, I came into the world and was inherited and just sort of handed, you know, a positioning that both advantages me, but also disadvantages me a lot, right? And being, to be queer and then to come out and then now to learn how to wear it proudly. And then it's not just that, to wear my Latinidad proudly and responsibly as well, which is why I like to talk about white privilege. I like to talk about all of these issues because I take it very seriously, wearing my identities with pride and integrity. So I think that is my proudest moment because the coming out was the catalyst for all of that, right? Not just being out as queer, but being very authentic about who I am, about my positioning in the world, and my sense of mission in the world, and what I am doing here, you know, and what is the voice that I have, and how am I going to use that?
Great. So you've been in Ohio all of your life, right? Except for your time in China.
Yes.
What does Ohio mean to you?
Yeah, well, since I've been in Ohio all my life, I think I haven't given much thought to that until what recently has made me think a little bit more about that is when my sister moved out of state for college and is in Massachusetts and has reported her whole freshman year, and now she's going into her sophomore. She came back, right, to sort of report, I didn't even realize how distinctive Ohio culture it is, or Midwestern culture it is. And was pointing out things to me that I didn't even realize, right? Like some of the lingo we use, but it's not just that. There's a subculture to Ohio, and there's a specific kind of identity and flavor to Ohio. And I've been only recently just kind of really coming to appreciate that and learn that, knowing that politically, the sort of historical significance of Ohio and the fact that it almost in a way is a miniature model of the United States as a whole in a lot of ways, I think is very interesting to me. I think of Ohio as that. When I think of Ohio, a lot of times I think of it as a very complicated, often misunderstood state, because it's actually diverse, and you know, it's a very surreal experience for me to visit my parents, right? Because I drive from Columbus to Canton, Ohio, and just that 2-ish hour drive, I feel like what happens is I leave civilization. Like, I leave this sort of Columbus. Not that Columbus is this big city, but, you know, here I am living here in the city. I feel like I'm sort of connected to the world and connected to civilization and what's happening. And then I leave, and I feel like even visually, where am I? Like, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's almost this, like, apocalyptic feeling of, like, driving, and there's just corn, and then Jesus saves, and then, you know what I mean? Like, this is, like, where am I? Like, the experience. And then I hit a city, right? This, like, island of civilization. And then, you know, a lot of times, that's what Ohio is for me. And I think... if I remember last year, I attended a Latino education summit that was happening in Kent. So I think I traveled from Columbus, went to Canton to visit my parents, stayed there overnight, went to the summit the next day in Kent, and then from there went and visited some people in Lorraine and later came back to Columbus. And that few days or weekend of a trip, it's like I entered and exited in such a short period of time so many different worlds, like vastly different worlds, just in that trip. Even the other day, I shop at Saraga a lot, and I was at like the original Saraga that has like Momogara inside of it and everything, and you know, going from this, even last year, this happened as well. Actually, last year it made more of an impression on me because I went there after work. So here I am in the State House working, breathing the same air as our state's leaders, and where there's this very specific kind of like professional culture, you know, that I have to squeeze myself into. And then I exit that and go to Saraga, where I'm like let loose and get back into myself and like, all right, what am I gonna cook? And I'm buying my plantains and my yuca and everything. And I buy and it's mostly, you know, like non-white, like immigrant people around me. And I leave and I see the wall of postings of essential worker jobs, right? This wall of just gardener and whatever, right? Maid and all of the things that they, you know, target our communities to do and that our communities do, right? And to see that wall, and it was just like this very, almost like a artistic or symbolic moment, because within an hour, I went from, you know, that environment of the State House where, and I think if I remember right, that day too, there was a very problematic bill that, you know, one of the legislators proposed, again, off the clock, so I can talk this way, but that, in my opinion, was very anti-immigrant. It had to do with it had to do with like proposing so that teachers in schools have a requirement to report students that they think are undocumented. Yeah, like something of that sort, right? So someone was proposing this bill, which incited all these emotions, right? When I see that, and I go from that to Saraga. And, you know, and just all these people that are strangers to me, that I'm surrounded by, that live in my community, that are here. And then to walk outside and see these job postings, something about that all together. I actually was really emotional that day because I was also missing Abuela, who has since passed. And I was thinking about her and thinking about her life. And Puerto Rico is, you know, a part of the state, so we don't have the experience of, you know,
going through the
citizenship and all of that. Yeah, we don't have that experience. However, nonetheless, I mean, her experience, without a shadow of a doubt, was as if it was an immigrant experience coming from, you know, it might as well be a different country, right? And she came and was an essential worker in the Ford plant factories all her life. Probably part of her reason she even got sick was because who knows, you know what I mean, being exposed to whatever in the factory. And that's what she did to, you know, have bread on the table for my mom and her siblings. all her life. And I just think about the experience of that, and then she was finally able to retire and gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's the next, you know what I mean? Like very shortly thereafter. I almost feel like she very much sacrificed herself and I'm her dream, right? Like, and here I am with a lot of the opportunities that I've been privileged to have. It was just a very emotional day, right? Because all in one, all of the stimuli that just kind of like, it was just very in my face. The big picture was very much in my face. And yeah.
And that you're able to see both worlds, right? Like, I think what you made me think is that had this person, this leader that was proposing this bill, visited Saraga with you, would he still think the same way? So,
yeah.
But you being able to go to those different spaces and having the experiences that you had personal, your perspective is completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
So, yeah. Thank you for, that's a great, it's a great example of why we need to be involved in different areas and understand different communities, because all of those policies affect real people, right? Yeah. Is there anything else, Joseph, that you would like to add to this interview about your life, about the work that you're doing in the community, or even the different organizations that you're a part of?
I mean, gosh. I think, yeah, I mean, we talked about a lot of things, and I mean, if you keep asking me questions, I could just keep going and going, probably. But I think even, you know, coming out of this conversation, one of the things I think about and that I've been reflecting a lot in the past year is intersectionality and how complicated we all really are, and the fact that we have so many different identities that interact with each other all the time, and our experiences that are so interconnected and are very complex. We're formed out of very complex intersectionalities that we don't always understand. And a lot of what, you know, we're talking about, I think, if I reflect, that's, you know, that's the core of what my experience has been this mixed bag of, you know, to be queer, to be Latina, but to be ethnically mixed as within the Latina community, and then to be white presenting, and, you know, to grow up in Ohio, to grow up in suburban religious Pentecostal communities. Yeah, it gives you a very unique perspective that positions you to have a specific type of a voice, you know, and to speak to very specific things. And I think that's what I've been trying to do now that I've gotten involved in LULAC. I'm very excited at the opportunity to possibly start a Rainbow Council and, you know, like offer my piece within the organization, which is, how are we, you know what I mean? How are we giving voice to and serving the LGBTQ population within Latinidad, you know, and having conversations with each other about what it means to be queer and Latina, and what language do we use, Latina, Latinx, what, you know, these are all of the things that I think about, and that I think everyone, you know, it's valuable for everyone to think about what is my intersectionality and how's that formed me, and how's that going to continue to inform me as I navigate all this.
Right. Joseph, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.